A True Picture of Emigration by Rebecca and Edward Burlend, Chapter 5, Part 4. This will be the end of the book. We pick up in the paragraph where she is speaking of the United States endowing land for schools. In the states where the land has become more valuable by an increased population, it is pretty good, and consequently commands men of talent. But in the remoter regions, there are numberless school allotments for which no candidate could be found. In Illinois, the teachers of these endowed schools, and there are few of any other class, except in large towns, do not assuredly make great pretensions to literary distinction. Happening to be one of the party at the examination of a candidate for the school land near our house, I was surprised to see how easily the bonus was obtained. The reader will perhaps smile when he is told that the spelling book was the only standard by which his qualifications were tested. What may be expected from the pupils of such masters is left for the arithmetical capabilities of the reader to determine. I may, however, remark that were it not for the influx of European immigrants and settlers from the more eastern states, all traces of a scientific nature would soon disappear. I have introduced this trait of character with a view to qualify the opinions which some of the foregoing facts might give rise to. In human nature, all the world over, there are certain bold mental and moral features which, under similar training, seldom fail to show themselves. I would by no means be understood to imply that ignorance and dishonesty are synonymous terms, or that an acquaintance with the arts and sciences prevents a person from being a knave. All that is here meant is included in the well-known statistical fact that crime is the most prevalent where the attainments of society are of the lowest order. This is a truth which modern investigation has fully established, although the ancients were not ignorant concerning it. And as narrator, I'm taking a break here. I'm not going to read that Latin phrase, as I must confess I cannot pronounce it, but it means a faithful study of the liberal arts refines the manners and corrects their harshness. The influence of Christianity on the morals of mankind is considered sufficient without the aid of education to restrain vicious propensities. True Christianity, practically enjoyed, must, I am persuaded, make its possessor a good man and a good citizen. But I am equally certain that the blessings that accrue to society thence arising bear a direct proportion to the state as to intelligence in which that society is found. For proofs of this assertion, I refer not to the experience of times gone by, when a second deluge learning overran and the monks finished what the Goths began. I intend rather to make good my position by a short account of the religious peculiarities of the people whose character I am attempting to portray. Prior to leaving England, I had been for nearly 20 years a member of the Wesleyan Methodist Society, and consequently felt wishful, as soon as our circumstances would allow, to join the religious body called the Methodist in that country. I attended a class meeting held in a house about 2 miles from our residence, but the manner in which it was conducted was by no means congenial to my views and sentiments. The company being assembled and seated, the one acting as leader rose from his seat, which was a signal for the others to do the same. A sort of circle or ring was then immediately formed, by the whole assembly taking hold of hands and capering about the house surprisingly. Their gesture could not be called dancing, and yet no term that I can employ describes it better. This done, worship commenced with extempore prayer, not indeed in language or style the best selected, but with this I have nothing to do. I have no right to question the sincerity of the individual, and if his taste differed from mine, it is no proof that his was wrong. The following part of the service was exceedingly exceptionable. All the persons present being again seated, an individual started from his seat, exclaiming in a loud and frantic shriek, "I feel it!" meaning what is commonly termed among them the power of God. His motions, which appeared half convulsive, were observed with animated joy by the rest, till he fell apparently stiff upon the floor, where he lay unmolested a short time, and then resumed his seat. Others were affected in a similar manner, only in some instances the power of speech was not suspended, and in this by the vehemence of enthusiasm, for I cannot give it a more moderate name. Finding in this mode of worship little that I could really respect, I resolved not long afterwards to absent myself from them altogether. I found, moreover, that some of the most rapturous members were far from being exemplary in their conduct, practically considered. As to their other forms of religious worship, I have few remarks to offer. The Americans are fond of the word liberty. It is indeed the burden of their song, their glory, and their pride. In some respects, this is praiseworthy, an essential ingredient in national honor and national greatness. But in my opinion, it is carried too far when it enters a sanctuary. It may be pleasant to hear of religious bodies worshiping under their own vine and fig tree, in the manner best adapted to their views and feelings. Views and feelings, it is well known, are dependent on educational precepts and original impressions. These therefore must vary, and experience shows they do vary proportionally to the endowments of discipline of the individual. And yet, religion is only one. The gospel is only one, and consequently no two conflicting creeds can be both right. How far a person's private judgment ought to be at liberty to originate, select, or improve modes of faith and worship, I pretend not to determine. If it be a privilege which all classes of the community may claim with propriety, no consequences can be more natural than those which have hitherto thence arisen, viz., the continual appearance of new sects or denominations. Either from constitutional peculiarity or educational bias, the minds of mankind possess faculties for thinking and feeling too widely different for them ever to be consentaneous, especially in manner where much is left imperfectly defined, probably as a test of obedience and faith. I have been led into this digression because, on hearing some of the preachers in Illinois, I have often thought them out of their place when they have been attempting to substantiate whimsies of their own rather than truths fairly deduced from the Word of God. The fact is, too little regard is paid either to the fitness of the preacher or to the sanctity of the office. If an individual's inclinations prompt him to become a preacher, little or no further explanation is demanded. This, of course, can only be understood to refer to the thinly inhabited districts where, I assure the reader, it is not necessary to be very fastidious in order to find ample reason for doubting whether, under the name of religious worship, there is not a mixture of superstition and unhallowed excitement. Besides the usual Sabbath observances, camp meetings are frequently held in the open air. These are commonly termed two-day meetings, though they are frequently kept up the greater part of the week. They are attended by persons of different denominations and conducted in a very irregular manner, one part of the assembly being on their knees, while the another is listening to an exhortation from one of the preachers. It is now requisite that I should once more resume my narrative. The reader is aware, I do not pretend to preserve it unbroken to the present time, the greatest difficulties incident to emigrants commonly occur at the commencement of their enterprising career. What our beginning was has been explained in detail. It remains therefore only to describe our present condition. Before I can properly effect this purpose, it will be necessary to state the particulars of that event which induced me once more to visit the shores of Old England, my own sweet native earth. Mr. B., the reader has been informed, got married about 4 years after our arrival. Being an industrious and frugal man, his affairs kept continually improving. He put out as loans several $100s, for which he received good interest. His cattle also was numerous, from which he obtained a good livelihood, by keeping under the plow as much land as grew them provender for winter. He lived, however, only a few years. I shall never forget, poor man, the last time he was at our house. I was rather unwell. After seeing me, he went round our farm with my husband, and then called in again to bid me good evening, saying he hoped I should be better when he came again, but how frail at best is dying man. That very night he began in the typhus fever, which terminated his earthly existence in a few days. He died childless and without will. Being in regular correspondence with my children in England, although I have till now felt it my duty to be silent on that subject, lest the reader should be entirely bewildered with the recital of anxieties arising from so many sources, I sent them an account of his death, and wished them to name it to his brother. This being done, the latter, who has a large family in England, and is consequently anxious to better his condition, took it into his head to visit the deceased widow in America, hoping to become entitled to some of his property. Accordingly, he left his family to take care of his home, and in company with another person wishful to emigrate, sailed for New Orleans early in the present year. Neither we nor Mr. B.'s widow were aware of his coming. We were all taken by surprise. Well do I remember the first appearance of these two Yorkshiremen, who had agreed to introduce themselves as strangers. Little did we think when we saw them rambling in our farm like two incurious travelers that they were objects of such interest to us as they proved to be. Self and husband were in the fields when they found us. I fancied I perceived a likeness of the Mr. B in one of them, and challenged him as his brother. I was right. Silence confirmed the conjecture, and we immediately invited them into the house, and treated them with good old English hospitality, eagerly devouring all the tidings we could elicit from them. I dare say we were thought tediously inquisitive, as we kept our guests in talk till after midnight before we allowed them to retire. The following day was spent in looking over our farm, and as the reader has been made acquainted with our difficulties, it is but just that he should know how we were situated in this occasion. In the first instance, I may state that the house we at present occupy has been recently erected, and though in externals there is nothing to boast of, it is much superior to the one we occupied during former years. The situation itself is more airy and open. Our furniture is also more in accordance with modern times than that we occupied at the commencement of our career. The three-footed stools which then served as our ordinary seats have long since been banished the house, and designated with the humble title of milking stools, and in short, our house has been entirely refurnished, and useful articles of various kinds have been procured. It is, however, not so much either in the house or its furniture that our success manifests itself. Were these to be made the principal objects by which possessions are estimated, there are, after all, few cottagers in England that would not be on an equality with us. With this exception, theirs are generally rented, while ours are our own freehold. I may further observe, with reference to the furniture at our house, that we have for many years had abundance, and I might say a superabundance, of those essentials of housekeeping, which, if not the most ornamental in a sitting room, are not the least valuable in a family. That is to say, we have known no lack of good food, such as beef, pork, butter, fowls, eggs, milk, flour, and fruits, all of which we have, as Yorkshire farmers say, within ourselves. But as I intimated before, our outdoor possessions were the objects that chiefly engaged the attention of our guest. At this time, we had at least 20 head of horned cattle, of which we kill or sell off some at every autumn. We have 7 horses, including 1 or 2 foals, besides pigs, sheep, and poultry, the number of which I am not able to state, as they keep continually breeding, and are never to be seen altogether. Our land, which is of excellent quality and very productive, pleased our visitants very much, who went round the greater part of it, although it extends to a great distance from our house, as we have by purchases made at sundry times 360 acres, more than half of which is cultivated. Not wishing to manage the whole ourselves, we have 2 small farms let off, for which we receive rent $1 an acre. It is not difficult to let land broken up at the above rate. Many who do not possess the means for purchasing land are glad to rent a few acres on which to grow provender for their cattle during winter and food for themselves. I wish to make no boast of our possessions, but having told the difficulties we experienced at our commencement, I ought in fairness to state what our success has been. I do this and no more. The lapse of a dozen years has wonderfully changed the appearance of things. We have seen a neighborhood rise around us, and in some situations, where at our first coming everything appeared to be in its native wildness, small villages have now begun to rise. Means of comfort are now within our reach. We remember the time when we knew not where to apply for an article, if at all out of daily use. And by the increase of population, we can now easily obtain anything we require, either as food, physic, or clothing, and were we disposed to give up labor, we could live very comfortably on the fruits of our former toil. One thing I would notice as a cause of our ultimate prosperity is that, having a family, we have been greatly assisted in the culture of our land, without having so much to hire as we should otherwise have been obliged. Were I asked what is my opinion respecting emigration, I would refer the inquirer to the foregoing narrative. Here are facts. Let him consider and judge for himself. If our success has been ultimately greater than at one time we anticipated, or even that of many of our neighbors, as indeed it has, it must be borne in mind that our industry and perseverance have been unremitting. If our cattle and lands have kept increasing, that increase is but the reward for the numberless anxieties we have experienced and the privations we have undergone. Few would undertake the latter to secure the former. Before concluding my narrative, I beg to state that I do not sympathize with those who assert that to leave one's country and become an immigrant implies a want of patriotism. There are a few facts bearing on this question which I may be allowed to mention. Is not, I would ask, the population of the United Kingdom as great as at the present time as its means can comfortably support and employ? And if so, how would the mother country be able to maintain the millions now in America that have sprung from her? The soil and mineral productions of America are of the most valuable character, rich in all that is calculated to make a community great, independent, and happy. The same all-bountiful parent that has given to Great Britain her vast resources, whereby her densely peopled towns and villages scattered over 1,000 hills derive subsistence, has been at work in America. Looking at the question in its more enlarged and true character, assuming that the entire earth is under the dominion of one man, how can we suppose that some parts of England, whose natural character is sterility, should be brought under a barely remunerating culture, while there are millions of acres elsewhere, as productive as any soil on which the common orb of day has shone, still a wild and uninhabited wilderness? These are questions to which time is giving and must give a proper answer, and in doing, the mother country itself will be no loser. The greatness of England, it has been long understood, is dependent upon its manufactures and commerce. And if so, I would further ask, what country has contributed so much to foster these manufactures and support and commerce as the United States of America? Thinking and feeling like one that is proud of her relation to England and that loves her own country, I consider it no disgrace to the British nation that I have traveled thousands of miles in America, from New Orleans to Illinois, and then thence on the Ohio by Cincinnati and Philadelphia to New York on my way home, that I have visited cities, some of which already number hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, and never found a place where, using my own English tongue, I had any difficulty in making myself understood or of comprehending all I had heard spoken. But to complete my narrative, the object of one of our guests, as already explained, was to settle in the country. Not having sufficient money to establish himself as occupier of land, he became a day laborer with immediate employment. Being entirely unacquainted with the method of farming as practiced in Illinois, his first wages were only $14 per month and his board. With this he appeared satisfied and said he found things better than he anticipated. As to Mr. B.'s brother, his purpose was to obtain something from the widow of the deceased, to which he certainly had a legal claim. Finding his share would be all in land, 160 acres, he soon manifested signs of impatience to be going back to England for his wife and family in order to occupy it. The idea of a person leaving us to go direct to the country on which a large share of my affections will ever be placed increased the desire, which I had never ceased to indulge, of visiting once more the shores of old England. The purpose now thus suggested was weighed over with the feelings such as the sensitive reader will not require me to explain. No feeble motives could have prompted me to take the step I am here describing. Connected with the thought of coming to England, dear as it was, I saw I should have to cross the Atlantic twice during the remainder of the summer, besides such tedious inland traveling. It required me to resist the entreaties of my children, who, with tears in their eyes, daily urged me not to leave them. But I will not go through these sad details. I will not repeat the arguments my neighbors employed to induce me to stay, how they reminded me that old age was beginning to number me among its victims, that it was in vain for me to think I could do as I had done. My decisive reply to these and many other obstacles which comfort, prudence, maternal, and conjugal love suggested was, "It must be now or never." Decided, therefore, to carry out the resolve to which I had come, I prepared to accompany our guest, and finally left Illinois for England on the 20th of April, where we arrived after a prosperous voyage on the 19th of June, and thus am I again for a few short summer weeks in my own country. I will not trouble the reader further with my story. If the account I have given of our proceedings, adverse and successful, does not allure his fancy with ideas of visionary prosperity as the invariable result of crossing the seas, it may perchance tend to make him a little better satisfied with his present condition, though it should only be a snug little cottage in the land where his childhood was reared. If it does this, it will be something. My purpose will be served, and thus, reader, I wish thee farewell. Note: the writer feels it due to state that the subject of this narrative, as implied above, returned after a stay in England of about 3 months, taking with her the daughter mentioned at the first outset as being left, the husband of the same, and their 2 children, besides a family or 2 of connections. Since their departure, 3 or 4 other families from their own immediate neighborhood have followed. Footnote: Edward Burlend, whose role in writing the narrative is recited in our historical introduction. Mary Burlend, the daughter alluded to on page 9 as remaining behind in England when the family migrated to America in 1831. On February 10, 1840, she married in her native Yorkshire Luke Yelliot. In 1846, the Yelliots followed the Burlends to Pike County, Illinois, where they established their permanent home in which John and Rebecca Burlend were sheltered during their declining years. See History of Pike County, Illinois, Chicago, 1880, 444. That is the end of the book, but I will end this by reading the prefatory remarks by Edward Burlend that I did not read first of all. Prefatory remarks. In submitting the contents of this volume to the notice of the public, the writer begs to state that the materials and facts herein contained were delivered to him viva voce by his mother, the principal agent in the narrative, during a late visit to this, her native country. To him the account seemed interesting in the highest degree, an opinion in which such of his friends as have perused the manuscript have invariably concurred. The present state of the public mind in regard to emigration has suggested the propriety of immediately giving publicity to the narrative, which is what might be termed the Diary of a Yorkshire Immigrant in the United States of America. How far such a production is required the public will now determine. It is what it professes to be, a true picture. The incidents are facts, not fiction. The language only in which they are described belongs to the author. Swillington, August 1st, 1848.